everybody. So we're live today with the Quint and BloombergQuint, and we're sitting with Dhruva Jaishankar. He's a fellow for foreign policy at Brookings, India. I'm sorry, I'm going to fumble a little bit. I've been awake all night covering the US elections, which is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. I'm also sitting with my colleague from BloombergQuint, Ayush. Hi, Ayush. It's nice to have you here. So we're going to be talking to Dhruva about what a President Donald Trump would mean for India, because that's what's happened. We now know for a fact that Donald Trump is going to be the new president of the United States of America. So let me pose the first question. And this is more about how all the polls predicted that Hillary Clinton would have a relatively easy win. And Donald Trump nobody really took the idea of a President Donald Trump seriously. So what was your immediate reaction when you were actually watching the results come out?
Well, I watched some of the results come out at the US Embassy here in New Delhi, along with you as well, and then some of the results at one of the television studios here in New Delhi. And I think there was a great deal. So there were plenty of Americans and also Indians here in the vicinity, and there was I think naturally a lot of surprise. Starting with the initial results, which made it seem like a lot closer than many expected, and then of course when a few key states started going decisively in his favor, North Carolina, Florida, and then finally Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, I think then at that stage people realized that this was really happening, and we now have President Trump having secured at least 276 electoral college votes, clearly now going to be the next president of the United States. Now, I mean, I think there'll be a lot of thinking in the U.S. Amongst political analysts in the U.S. as to why the predictions were so off. What were the polls not capturing? I think the easiest explanations, and this may be a bit of a cop-out, is that a lot of people who were being asked questions in polls about their support for Donald Trump were, for whatever reason, reluctant to admit that they were going to be voting for Donald Trump on Election Day. And so that tended to consistently underestimate the turnout. And we saw the same thing happen with the Brexit referendum a few months ago. So I think pollsters all over the world will maybe go back to the drawing board and figure what is it that they're doing right, or what is it that they're doing wrong, and what should they be doing right.
Absolutely. Ayush, do you want to come in on this?
No, Dhruva spot on. And I was, Dhruva and I were at the US Embassy at Roosevelt House at Ambassador Verma's breakfast party. And just as we walked in at 7 a.m., the mood was upbeat and everyone was confident that, well, most of them were confident that there was going to be a Clinton victory. And then spot on, because when we got that recent, that all of a sudden that immediate turn of events was what we were really, really surprised with. And then there was this morose sort of atmosphere. And then that turned into anguish with some of them as well. So, Mr. Verma actually addressed us at around 11:30, much before anyone took a call on the election. And, well, he obviously he was diplomatic about it, and he did mention that he congratulated both of them on this campaign, whoever did win. But it was clear that Trump did win this, and Trump did trump Clinton. But what's interesting is, Tharani and Dhruva, is the big question that all of us have, our viewers on the Quint, our viewers on BloombergQuint, is what this means for India.
Yeah, of course.
And Dhruva's, he's been doing research on this for a long time. Dhruva, when it comes to bilateral relations, what do you think this really means for the two countries?
Well, it's hard to say, and I think the big thing we'll be hearing in the next few weeks and months is just a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unpredictability about what a Trump presidency will mean. He is very unusually, he's a candidate who has not been very clear. I mean, he's articulated sometimes broad positions, but he doesn't have a very detailed policy. He doesn't have a very deep team of advisors, whether it is on economic policy or foreign policy. So there's going to be a great deal of uncertainty by all around, and uncertainty by extension, uncertainty about America as well. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, has already conveyed his congratulations to Donald Trump and said that he looked forward to working with him, as have other major leaders. What are the possible implications for India? I think one of the things that Trump has been consistently clear about is that he wants America to become a more normal country, a country that is not that doesn't embrace globalization, that doesn't necessarily sort of embrace a kind of Washington, New York elite consensus on economic policy and immigration, and also one that is he seems to be very consistently skeptical about U.S. military commitments, including alliances overseas, including the NATO alliance and countries like Japan and South Korea. So what does that mean for India? I think overall it signals some not very positive trends. I mean, this will mean a weaker America and Asia, just as India was hoping that that there'd be a closer U.S.-India partnership. So I think we will have to see. We cannot rely upon America to solve any of India's problems, if ever we could. And now I think there's a sense that we certainly cannot do that. That being said, I think there are always some silver linings and some opportunities. One of the possible silver linings is that we may see a more normal Russia-U.S. relationship emerge, or at least a less conflict. A relationship, a conflict-driven one, and that is overall something that is good for India. India has good relations, obviously, with the United States and with Russia, and would like to see those two have good relations with each other. When there was a breakdown of relations in the last few years, it really has come. India has been collateral damage in that.
That's really interesting, because Dhruva, because when you mentioned that, I was with Mr. Mansingh earlier today, and that's his first point. That whilst the US and Russia were really warring out there, we were in an uncomfortable position. Who should you be best friends with, or who should you really be allying with? Well, now it puts us in a little bit of a sweet spot. One there, and also in terms of Pakistan. If he does clamp down on terrorism issues in the region, then perhaps that does put us on a stronger foot.
I have a slightly different view on that. I'm not sure. Many Indian observers seem to be much more confident than I am that Trump will actually take a hard line on Pakistan. He has been very tough about terrorism and complaining about terrorism, and said that he will do something. But it's motivated primarily from a homeland security point of view. He does not want terrorists in America and on the American homeland. It is unclear whether he actually, in fact, everything indicates that he's very skeptical of the U.S. playing an aggressive role in other regions in terms of clamping down terrorism, say on Syria. It's actually quite surprising for both candidates how little Afghanistan, where the U.S. still has troops, how little Afghanistan featured in the election campaign. So while he does sometimes talk tough on terror, I think he will largely expect India to deal with problems in its own region. So India will actually have to play a more active role in its own neighborhood and in the wider neighborhood as well, both economically and politically.
Interesting. Tarani, all the time that you've been reporting on this, is that something that you feel as well?
So I don't want to actually make any statements about what I feel about Donald Trump's policies, because to be honest, I'd like to go back to an earlier conversation that I had with Dhruva, where I asked him the same question: what would President Donald Trump be like for India? And his response to that at that point in time was, I don't know, I can't say. And that's more or less where I'm coming from as well, because throughout the campaign, I haven't really seen any kind of policy that he's put forward that clearly outlines how the United States of America is going to be dealing with India in the case of a Donald Trump presidency. What I would like to know actually from Dhruva is, so one of the words that is stuck in our mind every single time that we think about Donald Trump now is China. And a lot of us have also begun to say China the way Donald Trump says China. It's something that he focuses on, and he does seem to paint China out to be sort of like this enemy figure. How do you think that's going to play out in the region? You are talking about a sense of withdrawal, a sense of normalization of the the relationship globally. I'm also guessing you're talking about a sense of withdrawal from being a security provider globally, the kind of role that the USA plays right now. But how do you think that relationship is going to play out, especially with India involved?
Sure. This is a relationship that India will actually be, might be incidental. It'll have indirect effects for India. But the US-China relationship is arguably one of the most important bilateral relationships anywhere in the world. It is in the two largest economies, two of the largest military powers, and while he has been very critical, it's been in very interesting ways. For example, he has threatened China with a trade war whatever that means. We're not entirely sure how that will play out, but if China is cheating the system, he will engage in a trade war with China. At the same time, again, he's said that he will pull back U.S. alliance commitments, troops in Japan or South Korea or Australia or other parts of the region, and that will obviously mean something very different for regional dynamics. It could in fact ensure that China has a bigger hand in say in the South China Sea. Now, what does this mean for India? In some ways, we could see an Asia that is dominated by China much earlier than many had anticipated. Many thought that this would take a lot longer to, if ever, it would come around. But sort of a conscious decision by the U.S. to withdraw, again, assuming this happens and assuming Donald Trump actually does what he says he will do, might mean that all of us, including India, will have to get prepared for this much sooner. And in real terms, that would mean India will have to probably increase its defense spending, particularly naval defense spending. It will probably have to forge other partnerships, security partnerships, not just with the United States, but deepen its relationships with, say, Japan, Australia, and other actors. And all of this is to ensure a stable balance of power in Asia.
Right. So, yeah, it seems a little confusing because we're passing the mics between the two of us. But just in case any of you were wondering why I keep looking at my phone, I'm reading your comments. So please send in comments, write to us. We'll definitely try and ask Dhruva whatever it is that you're asking. So a lot of people who are watching us right now want to know about visas. Because that's currently one of the biggest issues, especially with the kind of rhetoric that Donald Trump has put out during his campaign time. So how do you think that's going to be affected? Will working visas be affected, immigration, H-1B? Right.
And he said Donald Trump has himself said very contradictory things on this issue. On the one hand, he has sometimes spoken about negatively about immigration writ large. He said his campaign has accused companies of taking advantage of the H-1B visa system, which Indians are the largest beneficiaries of H-1B visas, which are largely software companies. They're high-skill non-immigrant visas, but many people can use them to translate to a green card, to transition to a green card. On the other hand, he has said, in one interview he said that I meet all these bright Indian students at Harvard and I would give all of them green cards as soon as they graduate. So it's unclear whether that anti-immigration sentiment is relegated only to low-skill immigrants, low-skill migrants, or if he'll make exception for high-skill migrants, or whether even if he does decide to make a difference, whether the system that he projects will and his supporters will actually acknowledge that difference. And they're actually striking parallels. We had Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, come here, and again you saw the new British government having to take a very fine line on this issue. Does the anti-immigration sentiment mean high-skill immigrants, or only some high-skill immigrants are okay? So this is a question I think that both the UK and the US now will have to confront. And I think if you were looking to get a visa to US, there's a great deal of uncertainty now injected into that process.
No, that's very true, Dhruva. And also, you mentioned China in your previous answer. And I was talking to Sham Saran just before I got here. And that was interesting, right? Because this is a gentleman, Donald Trump, who in his campaign actually spoke about China and climate change in the same breath and said that that's a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. Whereas, on the other hand, you had Hillary Clinton, who had some sort of policy on that point. And here we had him saying, hey, this is... So you said, it's so true that he has blamed China for a host of reasons out there. So what kind of ramifications do you think it could have on something like, climate change and environmental policy?
Sure. Well, I think one thing to keep in mind is that the U.S. is a very complex polity. It is the presidency is not. Is paramount, but it's not. He does not have complete powers as president. He will still have to work with the Congress and the court system, the judiciary, and he will have to work with the standing bureaucracy, a very large military and a military-industrial complex. And so I think all of these things, and not to mention states, of course, and states will often have their own policies. Many of them, say California has done things on climate change that are far ahead ahead of what the U.S. Federal government has done. So I think he will have to work with all of these. So I mean, this idea that he'll come in and he'll like flick a few switches and policy will change overnight. It may be harder, and in some areas he may be able to do that. And any president, and Obama actually had to do this too, had to basically see what are his priorities, what is he willing, what actually needs changes in law. And he decided, Obama, for example, decided healthcare was going to be that one of those issues, and it took a lot of political capital, but he actually got Obamacare passed in the U.S. Congress. So I think we'll have to see what is it that Trump feels passionately enough about that he's willing to invest that political capital, work with all the other actors that are necessary, and that leads to policy changes and policy outcomes. It may or may not be climate change. We may see him drop that, but it could very well be that. Who knows?
Right. So, do you have something to... No, okay. So, one of our viewers is asking a question that I'd like to actually add a little bit to. Hamid Siddiqui wants to know, what about removing the American troops from the Middle East? He says he's always been against the war. Will he walk the talk? I'd just like to add a little bit to that. So, there seems to be this dichotomy between Donald Trump, the person who wants to bring the American relationship with the world to a more normal level, sort of isolationism in an American sense, versus Donald Trump, the man who continuously says we will defeat ISIS. Right. So where do you think this is actually going to go? Is it going to be increased capacity in the Middle East but reduced everywhere else? How will this work out?
I think it's unlikely to be an increase. Yeah. We may see the status quo. Mm-hmm. I think that's not out of the realm of possibility, largely because, for all the talk he says about stationing U.S. forces overseas, it's actually cheaper in many ways for the U.S. to have forces overseas than to have them all based on the U.S. mainland and having to fly them out for operations. And in many cases, the host countries themselves pay to have U.S. troops there and heavily subsidize it. So I think he'll find that there's this very strange rhetoric. In a lot of Trump's rhetoric has a resonance about 25 years ago. This idea that Japan is this economic competitor, this idea that there are Mexican illegal immigrants coming in was really kind of a 90s thing. And again, we're seeing as the Mexican economy has gone well, we're seeing migrants, in fact, often going back to Mexico from the US because there are more jobs available there. So I think the same thing applies to a lesser degree to the Middle East, which is this idea that the U.S. has a massive troop presence there, which was true in the mid-2000s when they were fighting the Iraq War, when the surge took place, when the Afghanistan War was going full speed. But now, in fact, the U.S. presence has drawn down quite significantly. The U.S. has bases in Turkey as part of the NATO structure. It has bases in Saudi Arabia. It has a big naval facility in Bahrain, and of course Afghanistan, and then a few scattered other facilities. But it's really much more limited than it was even a few years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and the same reason that Tarani is looking down at her phone is the same reason I'm looking down at it, because people are writing in on Twitter. You can write in, you can tweet to us, you can Facebook us as well. Just drop a comment and let us know, either on the Quint page or the BloombergQuint page, and let us know what you want, which question you want to bombard Dhruva with, because we're clearly doing a great job at that. But Dhruva, so Rohan writes in on Twitter, he says, and this is a concern with a lot of people, it is about Donald Trump and, in simple words, a nuclear holocaust. I know it's far-fetched, but considering his rhetoric, in the build-up to the election, and also the fact that the other side took cognizance of it, because Hillary Clinton actually said, this is a man who you don't want anywhere near those nuclear codes. Well, now he's president of the United States. Should that be a concern for anyone?
Possibly. We had the Trump campaign recently take away his Twitter account from him. Yes. And I think you have to ask, if a campaign can't trust you with Twitter and tweeting things about sex tapes at 3 a.m, well, can they trust you with the nuclear code? Again, I think there are some checks and balances that put in place to this, and some of them have come in place even in the last 25 years or so. And in many cases, the U.S. U.S. nuclear arsenal isn't as at the ready as it was in the 90s. That being said, there was a very interesting article by Bruce Blair, who used to work as he was one of the people who actually had to launch the missiles against the Soviet Union, and he now has become a big advocate of nuclear disarmament. And he wrote an article in the New York Times about a few weeks ago, and saying a lot of it involved an absolute trust in the commander-in-chief, that you had to be ready to if you're in the silo, you have to be ready to push the buttons. But you trusted that somebody up the chain of command knew, you could trust them. And he then said, based on what I know of Donald Trump, I would not trust him in that position. So I think that will be a concern. But again, I think a lot of checks have been built into the system to ensure that a president who's drunk does not sort of get into his head to there isn't like a red button sitting in the Oval Office and he'll hit it and the missiles will launch. But I think there are concerns about his personality and he for example he has temperament, and he seems very susceptible to flattery. When people say good things about him, he doesn't criticize them back, even if they're and so whether it's the KKK or whether it's the Russians or whatever, he seems quite susceptible. I think that will be something for all the rest of the world to try to use. If you can charm the guy, maybe you can have him on side.
No, but having said that, I mean, this is something we must admit, that when he did come on for his victory speech, it was a changed demeanor. It was a sort of a different Donald Trump. It wasn't the same guy who was going out to those countryside rallies and really with those vitriolic campaigns, really.
And many of his advocates, even in India, I know many people will say, well, he's just another one of these politicians who starts off as a populist, and as he comes to the center. But I think the one difference, though, is, you saw, I think we could have made the case that he could run a primary campaign like that. That he was appealing to a base, he would win the party's nomination. But the fact is, he didn't run in the general election. He did not run as a centrist candidate. Yeah. He ran still as a populist. He found that was a formula that was successful, and as we found out, it was successful. So I think it'll be interesting to see whether he actually governs as a populist, or whether he decides, well, now is the time to change, and we now need to. I'm a grown up, and I now have a staff, and all of that. I need to come up with actual policy positions.
Let's just hope he doesn't think it's a reality show, because then we're all going to be in for a tough time. No, so you have more comments coming in, I'm sure.
I do, and in fact, I have something to say as well. I wasn't prepared for you when you said, so now that Donald Trump has become president of the United States of America, because though I've been following it and I know about it, every time I hear it, it still seems a little
President-elect Donald J. Trump.
Yes, it sounds fairly odd considering everything that's been happening over the last few months.
She needs to pinch herself.
Yeah, I really do. I'm not going to do that on camera, but yeah. So on that same note, Satish Prajapati is saying he's very aggressive, and I'm sorry for my words, but he will create some unbalance to the world, like he will cause unbalance to the world. So I'm not going completely in that direction, but I am saying that he has said a lot of things that have made a lot of countries extremely nervous. So in this situation, what do you think he's going to move towards? Is he going to look at pushing the same things? Even in today's speech, even though Ayush did say that he seemed like a more toned down version of himself, he did happen to say that we're looking for good relationships with all the countries in the world, as long as they want good relationships with us, as long as they're willing to have good relations with us. And mostly it seemed, or at least from where I saw it, it seemed like he was trying to be a good sport considering he had won. It would have been petty to do anything otherwise, but he was still making the same points. So I'm not sure where this is going to go. Is he going to continue down the same path, or do you think there is going to be a mellowing of President Donald Trump?
We don't know. I mean, my feeling again, and just based on the how we saw him transition from a primary candidate, insurgent primary candidate initially, to a mainstream candidate, to winning the general election, and he didn't really tone down. And so I suspect, his personality his instincts will be against that. That being said, I think I have maybe perhaps more faith in the U.S. system.
Yeah.
And the U.S. is a democracy, just as India is a democracy. And while this can be frustrating at both levels, it can frustrate, good noble causes can be frustrated, and things that are obviously seem like there are definitely policy issues here in India that everybody agrees is a good idea, but for some reason you can't implement it, and that's one of the frustrations of being a democracy. But the same system actually mitigates bad ideas, and so I suppose I have greater faith maybe than some people in the U.S. system, and perhaps a little less faith in him as a as a leader. But I think the two will perhaps sort of balance each other out. But I mean, that being said, I think we are in for a post-American world, at least for the near future. And even this injection of uncertainty makes it so whether or not the U.S. actually, whether or not Donald Trump does any of the things that he says he will do. And so I think we need to be prepared for that. We are in for a post-American world much sooner than many of us had anticipated.
You know, it's interesting because throughout this conversation for the past half hour, we've basically psychoanalyzed Donald Trump.
Yes.
And that goes to show what a personality-driven election it was.
Absolutely.
But guys, you know, what's interesting is also, and this I really want your views on, Dhruva, and a lot of our viewers do as well, is on the trade-related aspect of it, right? He really enunciated his views on TPP, on the NAFTA. Was it a political ploy, considering it was against Clinton? But having said that, do you think that this is someone who isn't really pro-free trade?
I think he's not pro-free trade. I mean, on a few issues, this being one of them, the skepticism of alliances being another. I have a colleague at the Brookings Institution in Washington, Tom Wright, and he has been actually going back to some of the things that Trump has said and written going back to the 80s. Absolutely. And his argument is actually this idea that it's all ad hoc and opportunistic is not true. In fact, Trump has had quite a consistent foreign policy and sort of external economic policy as well. He's been consistently skeptical of trade, so this idea that he's sort of making this up on the fly doesn't hold much water. That being said, it's going to be very hard for him to abrogate trade relationships in which the U.S. is already invested. It's very hard to get out of a trade agreement
or renegotiate
it. So, Chorus with Korea or NAFTA, I doubt that's going to happen. But I doubt he will go forward on TPP, and particularly the current. I mean, that I think is really going to be future, and TTIP, the negotiation of the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. I think that will also be shelved for some time. It certainly won't be a priority, and so I think he won't go back on existing trade agreements, but may not push for more.
So I have one really interesting question that one of our viewers has. Also, I think we're going to have to wrap up soon because Dhruva has to rush off. He's a very, very busy man. So we have one last question. It's from Hamid Siddiqui, and he just wants to know what you think is going on in Putin's head at this moment.
So the Russians actually issued a statement congratulating Trump, and I think I'm paraphrasing it, but Putin I think said we look forward to what was the word he used? Not a renewed relationship, but basically sort of getting back to normal, a relationship that gets back to normal. I think of course this is a preferred outcome for them. There were also hints that suggested that this doesn't automatically mean that everything is okay between Russia and the U.S.
Yeah.
So I think while it'll set a more positive tone in Russia-U.S. relations, and Putin is conscious of that. I mean, again, the structure, U.S. interests, and all of that, it'll still be very hard to just say the U.S. is not going to play any role in Ukraine, and the U.S. is suddenly going to give into the Russian perspective of things on Syria. That may not all happen overnight. And certainly, actually, the people who hold the greatest skepticism of Russia are actually Poland and the Baltic countries, many parts of Eastern Europe, and they're the ones who actually want the U.S. to remain there. So I think you'll have this some U.S. allies actually trying to lobby for Washington to remain engaged, particularly militarily, in Europe. So again, some of this may not change as dramatically as maybe Trump would like it to change.
Do you have any more questions?
No, I think Dhruva's also running a little late, so why don't you?
No, I think all in all, it's been an eventful day. Dhruva's been awake as long as I have. This one's been awake for far too long. So we're going to pack up for the day. Well, we do have a new president of the United States. Thank you so much for tuning into the Quint and BloombergQuint.